Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about Larry Weinberg, who was beloved by many Oregonians, one of our original owners of our wonderful basketball team, the Portland Trail Blazers, the owner who won the eternal gratitude from the people of my state as he guided our Trailblazers to their first title. And he passed away last week at the age of 92. And he was a soft-spoken man who was never one to drone on. So in that spirit, I'm going to keep these remarks brief. The first matter we want everybody to know about Larry is he was a wonderful family man. I met him for the first time in the early 1980s. I was a young member of the other body, the House of Representatives, and Larry could have made our first conversation about politics. We were very interested, for example, in ways to promote a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. There are plenty of things we could talk about with respect to politics, but he made the conversation about basketball, which is one of the great loves of his life. And people know, I think around here, that my great hope was to play in the NBA. Larry knew that. And because Larry was a family man, that first conversation that we had was about family. And Mr. President, he had an enormous family. If you look at the family photo on the holiday cards that Larry and his wife Barbie sent each year, you would think about half of the 320 million people in our country were actually Weinbergs. The cards were wonderful, and they just seemed to go on and on and on. During that first conversation, Larry asked me about family. I told him about my great-uncle Max, who was one of the last Jews to be murdered in Auschwitz. I told him about my parents who fled Nazi Germany as refugees and settled in America before they pitched into the war effort during World War II. And that was one of the first bonds I had with Larry Weinberg, and I think that was true of many of his friends. We had family who either were veterans themselves, loved ones who had wanted to make sure that the United States prevailed in World War II, and that was Larry. He served in Europe during the war and sustained serious injuries in France. Throughout his life, he carried that dedication to service that was so characteristic of so many of his generation. Larry Weinberg applied the lessons of the war to his leadership of the American Jewish community. He worked to promote understanding between religious groups while demonstrating a firm commitment to the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, improving the world. That, Mr. President, is something that Jews feel very strongly about. Whether it is healthcare or foreign relations, whatever the field, we want to be part of making the world a better place, perfecting the world. That's what tikkun olam means. Larry and Barbie Weinberg supported the development of concrete scholarship on issues that face not only Israel, but the entire Middle East, understanding that the difficulties affecting one neighbor's burdens are really part of a shared burden, demanding a shared solution. Portlanders like myself know Larry for another reason. If if you're a Portlander of my age and an ardent Blazer fan, you cheered on Bill Walton's Trailblazers because they won a championship for Rip City in 1977. If you're a young basketball fan in Portland today, you probably root for Dame. That's Mr. Lillard. Or CJ. That's CJ McCollum. All of us in Portland and in Oregon owe Larry Weinberg a debt of gratitude because he brought the NBA to our state. And had he not done that, all of us who root for the Trailblazers today wouldn't be able to turn out and see Dame and CJ and all of our wonderful players who are really community leaders. And I remember back then seeing Larry and his wife Barbie cheering at our home games. And they were always wearing our colors. You particularly saw that bright Blazer red. And whether it was back in the 70s at the Memorial Coliseum or even into their later years at Moda Center, you got a glimpse when you looked at Barbie and Larry Weinberg. You got a sense of what it meant not just to be a fan, but the Weinbergs really looked at our town and those Trailblazers as part of their extended family. Now, with respect to sports and the intersection of sports and how sports fits into the world, I wanted to relate something that happened in the late 1980s when Larry approached me with a particular request, something he wanted me to do. I was traveling to the Soviet Union with a group of Jewish community leaders from Portland, and at that time the Trailblazers were very interested in bringing a wonderfully talented center, Arvydas Sabonis, to Portland. And there was a discussion. It was kind of a period when the United States and the Soviet Union were still talking about the relationship being so ambiguous. President Reagan, Gorbachev were all trying to sort it out. And Larry asked me to present a letter to the Soviet Sports Federation about Arvydas Sabonis. He'd been actually drafted a few years before. And the idea was the Trailblazers hoped to bring Mr. Sabonis from the Soviet Union to the United States and play for the Trailblazers in the NBA. Now, as I mentioned, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were still somewhat ambiguous, but they were improving. And a lot of people believed that a Soviet-born player coming to play professional basketball in my hometown in Portland would help that along. So on this trip to the Soviet Union, Larry asked me to meet with the Soviet Sports Federation. And I was to, in effect, hand over a letter to the Soviet Sports Federation, making it clear that, and this was a courtesy letter, Mr. President, making it clear that if Mr. Sabonis was permitted to come to Oregon and play basketball for the Trailblazers, what the letter indicated was that Mr. Sabonis would be well treated, he would have comfortable accommodations, good training facilities, there would be people to advise on nutrition, get him acclimated to our country. Well, when I walked into this meeting in Moscow, I really felt like I was starring in Rocky IV. And there I was, a congressman, a pretty young one, from the United States, a former basketball player myself, and here I was trying to make the case on behalf of my hometown and the Portland Trailblazers to these men, all of whom were at least 20 years or 30 years older than me, and I was trying to make the case that if the Soviet Sports Federation was willing to allow Mr. Sabonis to come, he would be well treated. And what I got from these stern-looking Soviet Sports Federation officials were essentially monosyllabic answers, much like you heard in the Rocky movement. Maybe somebody would say, "Nyet." And I didn't know everything about the language of my hosts, but I got the sense that wasn't a good thing when they said that. And I could get the sense about their skepticism as if they believed that this young American congressman in front of them was pulling some sly trick of geopolitical strategy as we tried to bring Arvydas Sabonis to Portland. I tried to make the point to these Soviet leaders that we were not exactly talking about arms control. We were talking about playing basketball, and we were talking about building bridges. And that, if anything, Mr. President, is what Larry Weinberg's life was all about. He was about building bridges in sports. He did it in terms of housing when he was trying to create housing opportunities for people of modest means, when he was creating opportunities for people to learn from each other. And there he was with this young congressman just wanting to offer his guarantee that Mr. Sabonis, the best Soviet player of his time, would be well cared for. It took a few more years. Eventually, he made it to Portland, where Larry and Trailblazer fans got to watch him play and play well. And, Mr. President, I cannot find the picture, but back then there was a picture that ensured that Oregonians across the state were laughing at their breakfast table because one day it came out, Mr. Sabonis and I were strolling along the waterfront in Portland. I'm 6'4", not as tall as Senator Cotton, but 6'4", and I was standing next to Mr. Sabonis, who was as tall as the typical building. I mean, we thought that he might have been 7'5", which was taller even than listed. But it was a wonderful experience for me, and it was a chance to really see what Larry Weinberg was all about. And he always told me, it's a chance for you to learn a little bit more about the world, Ron. Chance for you to go to the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union at that time, and see about the connection between reform and what Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were trying to do, and the role of sports in terms of bringing people together. And I was so honored that Larry Weinberg would give me a window into that kind of opportunity and allow me in a really small way as a young congressman to be part of what his life was always about, which is building bridges. So I'm going to close this way, Mr. President. I think some of my colleagues are going to speak about Larry as well. When the Jewish people really want to compliment somebody and say somebody's really special and has exceptional character, what we say is, that person's a mensch. What I'm here to tell the Senate today is my friend Larry Weinberg, who we lost just a few days ago, was really a super mensch, a true mensch, a person of enormous integrity, decent at his core, And I just want to say that Larry and his wife, Barbie, were the essence of Rip City pride. He was a soft-spoken guy, but he was Portland's loudest fan. And tonight, I want to say to his family and friends, all seeming 100 million of them, I just want to say that we are always going to remember Larry Weinberg with great fondness, appreciation for his enormous contributions to our city and all that he did during his lifetime to be in that bridge building business, working to perfect the world, to Kuhn alum. A wonderful, wonderful man, Mr. President, our Larry Weinberg, who we Oregonians will always remember in our heart. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
And the clerk shall